So for today's demo sessions, what we would like to do is doing the embryo transfer catheter loading using the Wallace ESHRE Pro catheter. And at the same time, during the whole loading, we will share with you how to load the dish with oil and as well as without oil. And also Cornelia will actually share with you how to load it with the air column, what would be the ideal size. So let's begin. Cornelia? Now, just like any of the procedures, if we want to do, especially if this is the first time you are using the Wallace catheter, I highly recommend you to read through the instruction for use. This is actually very, very important. So if we go through the instruction for use, it's highly recommended that we rinse the catheter before we use, and this will be the first step we are going to share with you. Yes? What we will do is actually we will sort of like rinse and aspirate some of the media, approximately 0.8 to 1 ml of the culture media into the syringe. And at the same time, remove any air bubbles that is within the syringe. Now for today, my role is also to be the assistant for Cornelia, so I'll be opening up all the whatever consumables that is required, while at the same time, Cornelia, the person that is going to load, that will pay a lot of attention. Now it's kind of important that when we take the catheter out of the sheath, make sure that we do not contaminate the tip with any of the areas. Now, once we have attached the catheter into the syringe that filled with culture media, rinse the catheter through the media. And for the first step, I'm going to share with you, or we are going to share with you, how to load using the dish that is not covered with oil. And for these sessions, we are going to use the blue bits, as you can see. For the first step, Cornelia is going to create the air gap, as you can see. Now, once the air gap is being created, she will start to aspirate some of the embryos with a sufficient volume, then also another air gap. So the volume or the column that in the media column is usually about double the size of the air gap, and the air gap size approximately around 0.5 centimeter length, that would be sufficient. So Cornelia has successfully actually aspirated the embryos into this catheter, the ESHRE Pro catheter. And for the next step, we are going to show how to load the embryos for dishes that has been overlaid with oil. In this case, how do we want to do a transfer if the ET dish is covered with oil? Again, Cornelia, we're going to share with you. So the process is the same. Just aspirate some media into the syringe. Again, take around 0.8 ml of the medias. Okay, attach to the catheter. Yes. Now the process is also the same, where we are going to create the air gap, again load the embryos. Right. Then at the end of it, we also create another air column. Now the thing is, because the dish is covered with oil, it's always advisable that we have additional media Example, say for this case, we are actually using the central well dishes. So we have media at the outer well to rinse off the oil at the outside of the catheter. And this is kind of crucial because we do not want to introduce potentially any traces of oil into the uterine cavity. So the technique is kind of simple, as you can see from Cornelia. She just touched the media, the tip with the oil, that has some traces of oil to the media, and you can see the traces of oil that is being removed. And then we are ready and off to go for the person who is going to do the embryo transfer in the procedures. Okay. Now, for today's 2 demo sessions by Cornelia, my colleague, you can see how to load the embryo transfer catheter using the ESHRE Pro catheter. But again, apart from the ESHRE Pro catheter, we also have another, that is what we call the ESHRE Pro Ultra catheter. Now, the difference between these 2 catheters, which I will let Cornelia to show you under the microscope. As you can see, the catheter at the bottom is the actually ESHRE Pro catheter, ESHRE Pro Ultra catheter, where it's actually coated, the outer layer coated with all the microbubbles. That is the SureVeil technology that is unique to the our Wallace catheter. The benefit of having all this SureVeil or the microbubbles is so that the whole catheter will be able to visualize under the ultrasound when we do the embryo transfer. Whereas if, let's say, we are talking about using the ESHRE Pro, it is still a very good catheter, but it's kind of similar with any of the classic catheter that we are using. We have to create the air gap in order to be able to visualize where our tip is when we do the transfer into the uterine cavity. So I would say the ESHRE Pro Ultra would be a step up, the benefit of being able to see the whole catheter under the ultrasound. What do you think, Cornelia? Do you think that would be a better choice for any embryologist or IVF lab to be used in the embryo transfer procedures?
This is a very elegant method. You can see the catheter on the bottom, so where the air bubbles, the micro air bubbles are included. And you can visualize on the ultrasound from hub to tip, so the full catheter. That's really a big improvement. And it's still easy to load the catheter, so no worries for the embryologist, because the air bubbles are only in the outer material. So inside the catheter there's a layer without the air bubbles, so air bubbles will not stick anywhere in the catheter. So it's quite easy, and in a few seconds you can try yourself how easy it is. On the top you can see how we loaded the catheter, so you can still see the air gap, and you can see the bigger part, the media with the embryo, and then another air gap. But as Rachel already mentioned, according to the literature, it doesn't matter if you use air bubbles during loading or not. So no method is really superior. It's a bit up to you. It's most important that all staff from the laboratory perform the transfer with consistency. So that's the most important part. But you can choose either method. Both are really great. As we have been talking about pre-rinsing the catheter, would you maybe explain a little bit the benefits of pre-rinsing?
Sure.
It looks like most labs like to do it, but is it something we can recommend?
Right. So, of course, this depends on the practice of the IVF laboratories. Some of the laboratories, they will rinse the catheter before they use, and some of them, they do not rinse the catheter before they use. But what we always recommend is to rinse the catheter before we use. One of the reasons is because we want to rinse off potentially any debris that is present in the catheter during the manufacturing. I'm not saying that they will have, but again, we want to protect our embryos for potential any harm. So always a good practice just to use a little bit of the media, around 0.5, 0.8 ml of the media would do, just to rinse off the catheter before we used. And additionally, on top of that, another big benefit to my personal experience is it's good to actually rinse the catheter and coat the catheter with the embryo transfer media before we create the air gap. Because the media that we use usually will contain protein, and protein will serve as a so-called lubricant and whatsoever that's coat the inner lumen of the catheter, so that when we create the air column, when we create and aspirate the medias, it is much smoother and easier. Hence, we always recommend to rinse.